The stage lights blazed, illuminating the sweat-soaked face of a young man with slicked back hair. His eyes, intense and dark, locked onto the frenzied crowd. This was Elvis Presley, and he was shaking the world to its core. It was June 5, 1956, and Elvis was on the Milton Berle show. He was only 21, but he had already made a name for himself with his wild performances. As he strummed his guitar and sang Hound Dog, the audience was electrified. But it wasn't just his music that had everyone talking, it was his moves. Elvis's hips swayed and jiggled in a way that had never been seen on television. Girls screamed and parents gasped. Critics called it animalism and vulgarity, warning that Elvis was corrupting America's youth. But the more they condemned him, the more the teenagers loved him. Elvis wasn't just another pretty face. His hair, dark and greased into a slick ducktail, was a symbol of rebellion. He had copied the style from Tony Curtis, a Hollywood actor, but he made it his own. He used Royal Crown hair products to make his blondish locks look darker. And when he saw Curtis in the 1949 film, City Across the River, he knew he had found his look. With his hair dyed blue-black and his sideburns trailing down his cheeks, Elvis looked like no one else. He was the king of rock and roll. But it wasn't just his appearance that made him different. Elvis was raw and unapologetic. He didn't care what the older generation thought. He was a product of the South, a place where life was hard and dreams were bigger than the sky. He grew up in a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, and moved to Memphis when he was 13. There, he discovered the blues and fell in love with the music that would change his life. Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, saw the potential in this young man with the golden voice and the magnetic presence. Parker was a shrewd businessman who had worked in the circus before becoming a talent manager. He knew how to market Elvis, turning him into a brand that sold everything from charm bracelets to record players. By the end of 1956, Presley merchandise had brought in $22 million, and Parker took 25% of the profits. Despite his success, Elvis faced challenges. In April 1956, he performed a 4-week engagement in Las Vegas. The older, more conservative audiences hated him. They were used to the polished acts of the Rat Pack and the big band era. Elvis's raw energy and provocative dance moves were too much for them. The press was brutal, and the shows were a disaster. Parker cut the engagement short, and Elvis learned a valuable lesson. He needed to adapt to different audiences. But Elvis's biggest challenge came when he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show on January 6, 1957. Sullivan, who had previously vowed never to book Elvis, had a change of heart after seeing the massive ratings the singer brought in. For the third and final appearance, Elvis was filmed only from the waist up. The network was afraid of the controversy his dancing would cause, but it didn't matter. The girls still screamed, and Elvis's hair, slicked back and glistening with sweat, was all they needed to see. Elvis's performances were more than just entertainment. They were a cultural revolution. He broke the mold of what a performer could be. He was a boy from the South who became a national icon, and his impact was felt far beyond the music charts. He was cool, and he didn't give a damn what anyone thought. That was what made him so appealing to a generation of teenagers who were tired of the status quo. As the years went by, Elvis's image changed. He joined the Army, where his $105,000 a month earnings as a rock and roll star were reduced to $83.20 a month as a GI. When he returned, he was different. He started making B-movies, which were often forgettable, and his music became less experimental. But for a brief moment in the 1950s, Elvis Presley was a force of nature, a cultural harbinger who changed the face of American entertainment forever. And it all began with a young man with slicked back hair, a guitar, and a voice that could make the world stop and listen. Elvis's performances at the International in Las Vegas marked a new chapter in his career. The Colonel, Elvis's manager, pulled out all the stops, inviting New York's top rock writers to Vegas on Elvis's very own DC-9 plane. The reviews were glowing. Mike John from the New York Times described the experience as incredible, despite the flashy setting and the glamorous, somewhat campy audience. London's Evening Standard sent Ray Connolly to Las Vegas, and he managed to secure a rare interview with Elvis. Getting through to Elvis was tough, with security guards shadowing him everywhere. But Connolly persevered, and got a glimpse of the man behind the legend. Elvis was relaxed, sitting on a red Spanish sofa, wearing his signature black karate-style suit. He spoke candidly, blending humility with a touch of small-town charm. He talked about how he didn't come back to Vegas for the money, but because the time felt right. He also expressed his desire to move beyond his earlier films and try more serious roles, admitting he was ashamed of some of the songs and movies he had been part of. The concerts at the International were a hit. Elvis was as magnetic as ever, and his fans were as passionate. Women tried to grab his microphone, stripped in front of the stage, and even threw their underwear at him. The crowd was a mix of true Elvis devotees and those who were just in Vegas for the weekend. But everyone was there to see the king of rock and roll. Elvis's presence in Vegas wasn't just about the music. He had become a symbol of the city itself. Las Vegas in the 1970s was a place of neon lights, big names, and bigger shows. Frank Sinatra, Buddy Hackett, Anne Margaret, and Shirley MacLaine were all performing, but it was Elvis who drew the most attention. His shows were a blend of his signature rock and roll, soulful ballads, and a bit of Vegas showmanship. Despite his immense talent, Elvis's musical journey was somewhat stagnant. He had a natural gift, but he didn't push the boundaries like some of his contemporaries. The Beatles, for example, were constantly evolving, while Elvis stuck to what he knew and loved. This didn't diminish his appeal, though. His voice was unmistakable, and when you heard an Elvis record, you knew it was him. He didn't just perform songs, he made them his own. Elvis's impact on songwriters was profound. Bob Dylan considered having "Tomorrow Is a Long Time" covered by Elvis as one of his proudest achievements. British songwriters Doug Flett and Guy Fletcher were overjoyed when Elvis recorded "The Fair's Moving On," and even Paul Simon was reportedly awed by Elvis's version of "Bridge Over Troubled Water." By the time of his death, Elvis's popularity had seen a resurgence in the UK, with "Way Down" becoming a hit. The song, recorded at Graceland, was a fitting swan song for the king. It captured the essence of Elvis, powerful, soulful, and unmistakably his. Elvis's legacy was built on his natural talent and his ability to connect with his audience. He never sought to be a revolutionary. He just did what felt right. His music was reliable and consistent, and that's what his fans loved about him. He didn't need a complex plan or a grand vision. He just needed to be Elvis. And in doing so, he left an indelible mark on the world of music and entertainment. Paul McCartney once described Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel as one of the most alarming performances he had ever heard. When he listens to it, he imagines Elvis driving his Lincoln down a clear night on the interstate in Tennessee. The stars are twinkling, the air is warm, and Elvis is with his bandmates, Bill Black and Scotty Moore, on their way back from a show. Black's double bass is strapped to the roof of the car. After Black passed away, Linda McCartney got hold of that very bass, and Paul still owns it today. Elvis didn't just ignore the present, he ignored the past too. Frank Sinatra was still making great records in the late 60s and early 70s, finding classic ballads and anthems. There's no reason why Elvis couldn't have recorded songs like My Way, You Don't Send Me Flowers, or New York, New York. But apart from his gospel albums, Elvis's albums were often just a collection of songs without a clear theme. One of his best was 1971's Elvis Country, I'm 10,000 Years Old, which mixed Western swing, bluegrass, honky-tonk, and rockabilly. Despite his early success in the mid-50s, Elvis seemed to lose interest in building on that. His music in the late 60s and early 70s suggests he had dropped out of the race, not caring about what his peers were doing or competing with them. The Beatles were influenced by Elvis, but not always in the way he might have hoped. When they recorded Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, they decided to stay home rather than tour. Paul McCartney said they got the idea from a story about Elvis sending his Cadillac on tour instead of going himself. The story was true. In 1967, Elvis's gold Cadillac went on tour in Australia and New Zealand. The car was filled with toys and raised money for charity. It was a hit, and thousands of fans saw it. The car even toured the U.S., opening shopping centers and appearing at movie theaters to promote Elvis's films. The Cadillac was painted with gold lacquer, diamond dust, and fish scales, giving it a turquoise tint. It had a bar, a fridge, a custom-made lounge, a TV, and a phone. The back had an electric shoe polisher, a record player, and 2 8-track cartridge machines. It was like something from a futuristic cartoon, with a gold curtain separating the front and back seats and a fur-lined floor. The headlight rims, door handles, mirrors, and hubcaps were all plated with 24-karat gold. The car became a sensation, drawing huge crowds wherever it went. Elvis, however, was living a secluded life at Graceland. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, they were brief and didn't reveal much. At a press conference in Madison Square Garden in 1972, he appeared humble and grateful, but also seemed to be following a script. He was flanked by Colonel Parker and his father, who seemed to be guiding him. Despite his aggressive stage persona offstage, Elvis appeared very normal, which made his performances even more impressive. At the press conference, Elvis wore a pale blue suit with black trim and smiled throughout. He was polite and respectful, but his answers were vague and safe. He talked about waiting to play at Madison Square Garden, enjoying live performances, and being grateful for his success. When asked about his image, he said it was hard to live up to it. He mentioned that his audiences were mixed, with people of all ages. He had never been to Europe or Japan and wanted to go. When asked about his views on war protesters, he kept his personal opinions to himself. Elvis also discussed his difficulty finding good material for his music, especially rock and roll songs. He said he would consider a more demanding movie role, but wasn't interested in politics. He had no plans to take a break from performing, as he had grown used to the attention and would miss it if it stopped. He mentioned that It's Now or Never was his favorite recording and one of his biggest hits. When asked about the lawsuit by Nashville songwriters, he admitted he wasn't aware of it, but thought independent songwriters should have a fair chance. Elvis's press conference was a glimpse into his public persona, but it didn't reveal much about his inner world. Despite his fame, he remained a mystery to many, and hispans continued to speculate about the real Elvis. Elvis always had a belt that he wore, not just because it held up his pants, but because it was a special award from the International Hotel for his record-breaking attendance. It was like a trophy, but one he could wear with pride. When asked if he talked to his father, Elvis simply said, "Do I talk to my father? I have to. He handles all my personal affairs." His dad, Vernon, was a big part of his life, and it wasn't hard to see why. When asked about realizing how famous Elvis was becoming, Vernon recalled, "It's kind of hard to say. It all happened so fast. I'd say maybe 1956, after the first television show." Elvis chimed in, joking, "I tried to tell him sooner, but he wouldn't listen." Despite the sudden fame, Vernon had no regrets. "In fact, I've enjoyed it, really," he said. Elvis agreed. "It happened very fast to all of us. My mom, my dad, and me. Everything happened overnight, and we had to adjust quickly. A lot of good things came from it." When asked if Elvis had changed, Vernon said, "No, not really. I can't tell any changes." Elvis laughed and added, "I sweat more." Elvis loved mixing up his music. "I like to do a song like Bridge over Troubled Water or American Trilogy, then mix it up and do some rock and roll, some of the hard rock stuff," he explained. He wasn't tired of the old songs either. "I'm not in the least bit ashamed of Hound Dog or Heartbreak Hotel or whatever," he said. Retirement wasn't on Elvis's mind. "No, not really. I've got too much energy, I don't think so. Not as long as I can," he said. A world tour was also in the works, and he was excited about it. When it came to new groups, Elvis was a bit stumped. There's a lot of them. I can't think of any offhand," he admitted. His manager, Colonel Parker, always made sure to wrap things up with his usual line, "I'd like to live up to my reputation of being a nice guy. This is it, folks." Elvis's interactions with other celebrities were often memorable. When he met the Beatles in 1965, the meeting was more of a contest than a friendly gathering. According to John Lennon, "It was more fun meeting Engelbert Humperdinck. I can't decide who's more full of shit, me or Elvis Presley." Despite the awkwardness, Elvis was always polite and deferential, saying "yes, sir," and "no, ma'am," and standing up when older people entered the room. Even when meeting Roger Moore, future James Bond star, Elvis was nervous and insisted on calling Moore sir throughout their conversation. Moore found it amusing, saying, "Him in awe of me." In the early days, Elvis never assumed people knew who he was. Later, even when he knew they did, he remained respectful. His first big performance was terrifying. I was scared stiff. My first big appearance in front of an audience, and I came out and I was doing a fast type tune, and everybody was hollerin' and I didn't know what they was hollerin' at, he recalled. It was only after his manager told him they were cheering for his hip movements that he started to do more of it. The more I did, the wilder they went, he said. Elvis's rise to fame was swift, and he became a sensation. But he didn't always seem to understand the full impact of his influence. His career was often mismanaged by Colonel Parker, and despite his success, Elvis could be nonchalant about it. His life was a stark contrast to that of Carl Perkins, who had just as much right to be called the king of rock and roll, but lacked Elvis's looks and charm. Elvis's later years in Vegas were marked by a routine that became monotonous. He performed 2 shows a night at 8 p.m. and midnight, and often stayed up all night. Band members recalled that Elvis would invite them to his penthouse to hang out and sing. "Of course, when Elvis invites you, you can't say no," said Terry Blackwood. Elvis's shows became a nightly ritual, with only minor variations. He might be in good voice one night and just mumble the next, but his fans were always satisfied. Behind the scenes, Elvis was bored and wanted to be at home, but he continued to perform, adding more pageantry to his shows. Sammy Davis Jr., a big Elvis fan, was often in the front row during Elvis's Vegas performances. During one show, Elvis singled out Sammy, walked down to the edge of the stage, and gave him one of his rings. "Here, have my ring," Elvis said. Sammy was thrilled, as he too was obsessed with jewelry, clothes, and the good life. Vegas in the 1960s was a place of dreams and riches, and Sinatra was a big part of that. He performed hundreds of shows, often in the early hours of the morning, and rehearsed until he was satisfied. His shows were simple, with just a microphone, a glass of bourbon, and an orchestra. He treated the stage like his living room, and his performances were legendary. Elvis's move to Vegas felt right, as the city was seen as the epitome of the American dream. It was a place where entertainers could find fame and fortune, and Elvis was no exception. He brought his unique style to the desert, and for a while, it was a perfect match. Sinatra and Elvis, 2 giants of music, had very different ways of connecting with their audiences. For Sinatra, it was all about the smooth, effortless charm. He could ad-lib jokes and comments that felt natural, even when he was being a bit rough or telling off color stories. One night, when the crowd was getting a bit rowdy, he playfully said, "SHHHH, when I want you to speak, I'll turn the lights on you. No, I don't mean that facetiously, I mean it abruptly." It was moments like these that made the audience feel like they were part of something special, like they were in on a secret. Sinatra's performances were filled with these magical moments. He could be singing a song and suddenly change the melody in a way that felt perfectly natural. Even when his voice wasn't as strong as it used to be, his presence carried the songs. He moved through the music like Michael Caine moves through a film, as if nothing could be more natural. Even in the late hours, after the audience had been drinking and losing money at the tables, they weren't just there for a concert. They were there for a deep, personal experience, like a visit to their own personal deity. Elvis, on the other hand, was all about the spectacle. When you landed at the airport, you couldn't miss the giant neon sign that read, "Elvis in person." It was a big deal, and the room where he performed, the Showroom International, was huge and far from intimate. Elvis looked like a wrestler in his blue karate jumpsuit, and he would race through his greatest hits at breakneck speed, often with the help of a 6-piece band from Memphis and a 25-piece orchestra. His backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations and the Imperials, were dressed in flashy, revealing outfits, and the room was decorated with giant statues of Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV. Elvis's performance was intense and fast-paced. He would welcome the audience and then launch into another medley, sounding almost like an Elvis Presley tribute act. After a few minutes, he'd take a break, grab a drink, and then come back for more. Unlike Sinatra, who often sipped whiskey, Elvis stuck to non-alcoholic drinks. Later, he would share stories about his past, like how he got started in high school and the controversy over his stage movements. He talked about being drafted, making movies, and feeling stuck in a rut in Hollywood. But in Vegas, he could do his thing. even if it was only for a while before he'd be put away again. The dressing room after the show was a reflection of Elvis's mood. If he thought it went well, his friends, known as the Memphis Mafia, would agree. If he thought it went badly, they would concur. They were always watching him, trying to gauge his mood. Elvis was under intense scrutiny, and he didn't want to leave anything to chance. Playing in Vegas was the ultimate achievement for a solo performer, but it also meant that once you were at the top, the only way was down. Elvis worked hard to keep his show fresh, but after a while, he started to feel bored and repetitive. The audience would applaud and laugh no matter what, and he wondered how far he could push them. Imagine a different world where Elvis decided to embrace his darker side. He could have become a gothic, erotic version of himself, performing in a red velvet world filled with crucifixes and coffins. He might have told a tragic story about a beautiful young bride who died on their honeymoon, and sang about it for 20 minutes. The stage would be filled with symbols of sex and death, and the security guards would look like zombies or deranged lab assistants. His performances would be filled with long, drawn-out versions of his libidinous songs, and he might even grind in front of the women in the audience. In this dark version, Elvis would turn the ballroom into a kind of gothic bordello, where the atmosphere was filled with soft-focus sleaze. He would touch the women in the audience, and they would scream and holler if he didn't come down to their level. The room would smell of leather and candles, and the cocktail list would have names like Slow Comfortable Screwdriver and Hot Pearl of Woman Need. Women would be treated like celestial goddesses, and Elvis would be their dark, seductive king. In this world, Elvis would have pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, and his shows would have been a blend of sex, death, and intense emotion. He would have been a different kind of star, one who embraced the darker aspects of his personality and turned them into a unique and unforgettable performance. Elvis's shows in Vegas had a special kind of magic. He knew exactly how to make the crowd go wild with just a curl of his lip or a thrust of his hips. The women in the audience, mostly middle-aged and decked out in their finest, were there to be swept away. They didn't mind being manipulated. They expected it and even loved it. The room where Elvis performed was filled with waitresses who looked like they had just stepped out of a Playboy club. They wore high heels, fishnet tights, and low-cut sequin swimsuits. Some even had little devil's tails and horns, adding a playful, slightly naughty touch. These waitresses, many of them former cheerleaders, worked hard to keep the drinks flowing and the tips coming. They had to do more than just serve drinks, though. Sometimes they had to do favors for their bosses to get better jobs in the casino. Elvis's new songs were different, too. He sang overwrought Latino ballads with titles like What's Inside a Woman and Till I Come Inside. These songs made the women in the front row go wild, and the seats would often end up soiled, just like when Elvis first played in movie theaters in the mid-50s. One woman said, "He's so dirty," in a fake outraged tone, but another woman just smiled and said, "I know, it's great." Elvis had a way of making the women feel special. He would walk through the crowd, kissing hands and whispering sweet nothings. He joked about his big jumpsuit collar needing its own hanger, and the women laughed and blushed. Some of them even whispered room numbers or slipped keys into his hand. The husbands in the audience often had to pull their wives away, not out of jealousy, but to protect them from getting too carried away. Elvis's final song of the night was always Love Me Tender. He would kneel on the stage, holding a microphone in one hand and a cane in the other, and sing it with a saxophone playing softly in the background. The women in the audience were mesmerized, and the room was warm and musky, a stark contrast to the cold desert outside. Elvis loved the attention and the adoration. He even thought about recording a live album at the venue, with a cover full of photos of his fans. But the real magic happened when he interacted with the crowd. He would joke and flirt, and the women would touch his hair and collar, staying a little too long when they went in for a kiss. After the show, the women would talk excitedly as they left. One woman said, "I know it's wrong, but I'd stay in Vegas one more night just to be with Elvis. That boy could make me forget everything for a week." Above the atrium, a giant velvet Elvis flag hung, showing the present-day Elvis with a touch of blue in his hair and a quivering lip. The women ignored it as they went back to their rooms to freshen up, but behind the scenes, Elvis was struggling. His last concert was in Indianapolis on June 26, 1977. He wore his Aztec jumpsuit, a symbol of his sacramental glamour. Bill Ballou, the costume designer, was working on a new outfit with lasers. They were planning to try it out on the new tour, but Elvis never got the chance. Elvis was overweight, tired, and his drug abuse was getting worse. Priscilla, his ex-wife, wrote about how he was unhappy and abusing his body. He thought he was indestructible, but the pain was killing him. He had missed out on many opportunities, like starring in A Star is Born with Barbara Streisand. His manager, Colonel Parker, had turned down these offers, keeping Elvis in a state of stasis. Elvis's future was uncertain. He had been offered roles in other films, but they were all turned down. John Carpenter even wrote a script for Elvis and John Wayne called Blood River, but it never happened. Elvis was trapped in a cycle of missed opportunities and unfulfilled dreams. The women in Vegas loved Elvis, but he was a man in pain trying to hold onto his magic. The last few years of his life were tough, and the world would soon lose one of its greatest performers. Elvis's world was a bubble, a place where only those who worshipped him could enter. Inside this bubble, there were no duets, no co-stars, no joint headliners, no collaborations, no charity records, and no guest stars in his live shows. There was nothing but Elvis. The idea of Elvis singing a James Bond theme song was a dream for many fans. His deep, baritone voice would have fit perfectly with John Barry's orchestral scores. Imagine Elvis singing Thunderball, From Russia with Love, or We Have All the Time in the World. The music was elegant and dramatic, full of mystery and class. It was the perfect soundtrack for a world of gadgets, beautiful women, and fast cars, everything that Elvis loved. Elvis was a huge fan of James Bond. He was fascinated by the gadgets and the lifestyle. He even tried to get his hands on some of the cool gadgets he saw in the movies. He loved walkie-talkies, attaché cases, and even one of the earliest mobile phones, inspired by the car phone in From Russia with Love. The thought of Elvis as Bond wasn't just a fan's dream. There were even mashups on YouTube where Elvis's songs were mixed with John Barry's music, like Surrender with the Skyfall trailer. Elvis's voice, with its hint of camp and archness, would have fit perfectly with Barry's swirling strings and staccato flourishes. The irony and self-deprecation in the Bond films would have humanized Elvis, bringing him a whole new, younger audience. Elvis's last movie was a Bond film, The Spy Who Loved Me. He watched it late at night on August 10, 1977, just a few days before he died. He was particularly interested in the gadgets, like the ticker tape watch and the KGB music box radio, and he joked about wanting them delivered by the time he got back from his tour. By 1977, Elvis's concerts were far from the high-energy shows of his prime. They had become tragic and sad. Elton John and Bernie Taupin saw him perform in Washington just a few months before he died. They described a man who was heavily drugged, barely able to sing, and just standing there handing out scarves. Elton John said, "He's not long for this world." Despite his condition, Elvis's shows were always packed. His fans still loved him, even if he could no longer perform at his best. He still used some of his old moves, and he could still milk the crowd. One fan said, "It doesn't matter, he's Elvis." Elvis was often reluctant to expand his talents, partly because his fans didn't want him to. They were content with the old formula, and he didn't see the need to change. His concerts were grand and operatic, and he looked the part, like a formidable figure on stage. After his shows, Elvis liked to entertain guests, including other rock stars. Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin was particularly impressed by Elvis. He said that Elvis's voice was confident and powerful, and that he was driven. They even sang together backstage, with Elvis singing Love Me and Plant joining in. Elvis had a lot of female visitors backstage, but he was careful about his image. He didn't want to appear trashy in the press. He told his audiences, "I don't read movie mags. If they don't know something about me, they make it up." Meeting Elvis was a big deal. He was the king, and everyone wanted a moment in his orbit. Some women had designs on him, but most just wanted to say, "I met Elvis and he was like this." Fans wanted to confirm that Elvis was as nice and well-mannered as they expected. They wanted to prove that the king was even better than they thought. Backstage, Elvis could be boorish and crass, but he was rarely offensive in front of outsiders. He had genuine Southern charm, even if he could be a bit gruff. And like some other stars, like Frank Sinatra, who could be dismissive and offensive, Elvis generally tried to be polite and welcoming. In the end, Elvis's world was a complex mix of grandeur, tragedy, and legend. His fans kept him going, and he kept them entertained, even when his performances were no longer at their best. The idea of Elvis as Bond was a tantalizing what-if, a dream that never came true. But the world of James Bond, with its glamour and sophistication, was a perfect match for the king of rock and roll. Elvis's life was a mix of shining moments and deep shadows, especially in his later years. His fame and the love he received from fans were undeniable, but beneath the glitter, there was a man who often felt alone and misunderstood. In the late 1970s, Elvis's performances in Las Vegas had become routine. He was tired of the same faces, the same expectations, and the same songs. The magic that once electrified his shows was fading, and he seemed more like a sleepwalker than the king of rock and roll. Despite this, his fans still adored him, and for many, especially women, seeing Elvis was a once-in-a-lifetime dream. They would giggle, blush, and sometimes even cry, overwhelmed by the presence of their idol. For Elvis, these meet and greets were a way to connect with the outside world, but even these moments felt predictable and hollow. Elvis's relationship with religion was complex. He was a believer and often sang gospel music, but his personal life was marked by excess and contradiction. Fans sometimes brought their sick children to his concerts, hoping for a healing touch. This only added to the pressure and the feeling of being trapped in a role he couldn't escape. Hawaii was a special place for Elvis. It was where he could find peace and a sense of freedom. He made 3 movies there and performed in concerts, but most of all, he loved the islands for their beauty and the way they made him feel. Hawaii was as far away from the chaos of Hollywood and Las Vegas as he could get. It was a place where he could be just another person, even if only for a little while. Elvis's last concert in Las Vegas was on December 12, 1976. By this time, he was deeply unhappy and often felt alone. His performances were no longer the joyful experiences they once were, and he struggled with the demands of fame. In his suite at the Hilton, he wrote a note expressing his weariness and his desire for peace. He felt like he was living a life that no longer made sense to him. Despite the challenges, Elvis's music and his legacy continued to inspire people. His final performances, even in their melancholy, were powerful. He would sing songs like "Can't Help Falling in Love" and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and the audience would be moved to tears. In those moments, there was a connection that transcended the stage and the crowd. It was a bond between Elvis and his fans that would last long after he was gone. Elvis's love for Hawaii and his deep connection with his fans were 2 of the few constants in his life. Even as he faced the end, these things brought him some solace. When he passed away on August 16, 1977, the world mourned the loss of a legend. But for those who knew him, and for the millions who loved him, Elvis would always be the king, a symbol of a time when music and passion could change the world.